Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Andreas Schleicher, who is Director for Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He initiated and oversees the program for international student assessment and has worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. If you enjoy this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Andreas, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for hosting me.
So you started studying mathematics and physics and ended up in educational policy, which is, quite the journey. So why don't you start by just telling us about this background and your interest and how you came to working on the problems you're working on today?
Well, I had my first job in medical research, actually working as a scientist, but then I had to do my civil service, which you had to do at this time in Germany. And I worked in a school for disadvantaged children, and that really got me interested in education. So I changed my career, and I'm really happy about it.
So how has studying the hard sciences and being a research scientist for a certain amount of time influenced the way you approach measuring outcomes or designing policy objectives?
It's a good question. I often think that we shouldn't consider education less of an art, but we should start to consider it more of a science. I find that perspective often missing. We have a lot of really good ideas tried out in classrooms by people, but we are not, very good at scaling and spreading innovation because we do not, keep track of the nature of it. And the more I think scientific thinking we can bring into education and its processes, the more successful we will see innovation, I believe. And I found it actually a missing perspective that has, led me to run global educational comparisons. In education, we tend to look upwards in the system, the teacher to the school principal to the school district. We too rarely look outwards, the teacher to the next teacher, the school to the next school. And I think creating a kind of stronger fabric in education is something that really relies on good science.
So would you say that there's plenty of innovation happening in the education space? It's mostly a matter of tracking the outcomes and scaling those out when we find something that works.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a lot of, particularly in this pandemic, we have seen unprecedented both technical and technological and social innovation in education. But whether this will remain and be of enduring relevance will depend on whether we understand its nature, whether we can sort of make it systematic, whether we can scale it. And I am not sure we are very well prepared for this in education. Teachers don't have a culture of being creative designers of innovative learning environments. They're often, very much, occupied with transmitting a knowledge rather than about, questioning it and building new kind of science around what they do. I wish, every teacher would be in part also a researcher, in part a designer, in part a coach, a mentor, a facilitator. I think we would have very different education systems then.
What has innovation been like in the United States or around the world? And I'm obviously more familiar with the example here in America, but the impression I get is that not that much has changed in 50 years or a century. I could be totally wrong about that. Has there been a lot of innovation in this space?
Well, certainly the gap between what our societies and economies demand from people and what schools provide has not become smaller but wider. Clearly, if the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, they are also easy to digitize, to automate. In a way, we have become very good at educating, second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we tell them, which used to be very, very useful centuries ago. But today, I think we need to think much harder what makes us human, how we, complement, not substitute the artificial intelligence in our computers. And I think that requires a very, very different scale of innovation. Innovation is important to make education more efficient and effective. Clearly, the United States is a case in point. You spend a lot of money and the outcomes are just so.
Yep.
But that is even the minor concern. The bigger concern I have is that education is losing its relevance and purpose. Young people simply, fading out because they can no longer relate what they learn to their own future. And that is, we do not innovate what students learn, and we do not innovate how students learn. Just on the what question, when I started with the PISA comparisons in mathematics, I asked myself, why 10th graders learn so much trigonometry? And then you ask the mathematicians, is that the core, the foundation of mathematics? And the mathematicians told me, no, it's just, one specific application. You don't need to learn this to understand math. I asked the engineers, is trigonometry something you really need in tomorrow's engineers? And they say, well, it's all digitized today. You don't need those skills. Why do we teach it? Because 300-400 years ago, we needed those kinds of skills to design, measure the size of our fields or design our houses. But we have not got rid of it, and we have not created the room for the kind of big questions of our times. And I think that should be a big concern.
You bring up a great point, because I've been saying for a long time that we dedicate most of our time teaching just in case information. Just in case you might need this sometime in the future, you need to learn this entire book of world history or mathematics or sciences. And invariably, the amount that we actually put to use is somewhere close to the single digits, maybe 1 or 2% of all that information. And it's always struck me as the much better way to go is to teach just-in-time information, just at the time that you need it, if we can actually scale up some sort of learning process at that moment when you need it, rather than clutter all your brain cells with all this vast information that never gets used. There's pluses and minuses to doing that, though.
I agree with this. Our school systems have become a mile wide and just an inch deep. We teach a lot of stuff at very superficial levels of depth. But to do what you're looking for, enable people to just-in-time learning, we have to focus on better learning strategies. We have to focus on building the motivation, the resilience for people to learn. Rather than teaching you, lots of facts and figures and biology and chemistry, teach you how to think like a scientist. Now, can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Then you can master the scientific knowledge of your times. Now, can you think like an historian? Not teaching people about names and places, but teaching them, how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unraveled. If you can think like an historian, you will learn on your own when you need it, how you need it. But basically, giving students a deeper understanding of the nature of the discipline, the architecture of the discipline, will enable them to master the content and knowledge. Now, the biggest challenge we face is to teach fewer things at much greater depths now.
So I kind of want to stick with this theme for a little while. And your title is the Director of Education and Skills. And in your work, you emphasize that the schools of tomorrow need to teach students how to think for themselves, also how to work in groups, how to develop a strong sense of right and wrong. And I suspect that most people would have a less expansive view of education. So just walk me through how you approach what education should be and possibly how we move closer to that ideal.
Well, you can imagine the future of technology, the capabilities of digital technologies. We study that very carefully at the OECD. What are computers up to today? What will they be capable tomorrow? And then we need to think, how we can complement that with human capabilities. You will need great engineers, but, technology will amplify the capabilities. So it becomes about becoming an ethical engineer, being able to distinguish, good and bad, right and wrong in your capabilities. So I think we need to think harder how we complement the technological capabilities and the human capabilities. That's what we basically do when we talk about curriculum design, and not to substitute technology, but to complement it. That's one angle to this. The other angle I think is the connectedness in our world. You simply have to much more. In the past, you could live in a little bubble and be quite successful. Today, you have to, understand how people think differently, how people live in different cultures and different traditions. And you have to look across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines. You have to, and those capabilities, I think, are another very, very important dimension. And building that kind of bridging social capital. We are all comfortable with living with our family and people who are our friends and who we have grown up with. And we often struggle to live with people who think differently from us, who work differently, who look differently. But again, I think that is one of the challenges of our times, to build more collaborative learning experiences in schools and education. So I think we cannot imagine the future, of course, but we can look at the drivers of that future, and we can start to think in terms of multiple and maybe alternative futures, and then learn to navigate among them. And I think that's really the challenge that faces education systems today. You cannot imagine a specific set of content that you need to teach, but you can ask yourself, what are the drivers of the changes that we're going to see in tomorrow's world, and how can we make people resilient and capable to thrive on that? I think the pandemic has been a perfect test, but the future will always surprise us.
Yeah, a few years ago, I hosted an interactive session. We brought in about 30 kind of thought leaders in the education space, and we did a session on the future of education, with the goal of trying to come up with some sort of an end goal, a competition that we could sponsor that would move education forward. And throughout the day, it was a very spirited debate that deteriorated into name calling and yelling at each other. And suddenly I came to the conclusion that nobody's on the same page in the education world, and it means different things to different people. And so as a result, we weren't able to come up with anything meaningful out of that session. Is that what you run into a lot? Is that we have a lot of really deep-seated, ingrained thoughts about how education should be happening, and nobody wants to change?
Yeah, but I think we come back to this point that we need a better and deeper scientific underpinning for our ways of thinking. I grew up as a physicist. I can talk to anyone in the world about almost any problem in physics. At least I could in the past when I was still up to speed with the field. In education, we do not have that shared narrative, that common understanding, that scientific underpinning. I really believe that's where we need to start. If we do not have a common language, we will not build a common understanding. We will use similar words for different things, similar concepts for different phenomena. And I think that's where education needs to work on. And I think we have the tools today. That's the great thing. If you look actually at the research tools that we have at our disposal, they are just amazing. If you look at the data sources that we have available, in the past, when you wanted to know something about what students learn, you had to give them, a large test. You had to analyze the results. Today, learning analytics gives you real-time access how different students learn differently. It's just amazing. We have the tools, but we need to invest in the science. If you could treat this as, folk wisdom that is traded by, tradition and personal experience, you will not see any changes. And part of this is actually, at the fault of public policy itself. We have created a very industrial work organization in education. We have this illusion that there's someone in, the Department of Education or the district who knows what millions of students should be learning. And then, that trickles through the school system in terms of books and instructional material. And we have disempowered educators, teachers at the front line to become, owners of their professional practice. If you are working, when I started in my career in medical research, You are used to doing clinical trials. You're used to experiment. You are held accountable if things go wrong. Actually, people will sue you if you make a big mistake. In education, we do not have any of that culture. And I think the scientific underpinning, building a common conversation is a starting point. That's why I devote, my career to at the OECD. That's why I created instruments like PISA to get people, share experiences in a more systematic way.
What is driving the state of the scientific investigation of education? Because it's not as though people haven't been collecting data for a long time. And it's not as though there hasn't been massive amounts of public sector and private sector spending on this. So people have been looking at it for a long time. There's a vast literature on education and cognition and pedagogy and all that. So why is it as bad as it actually is? Like, why is this conversation not there?
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. I think the issue is really that we have obviously a lot of research, but it's entirely disconnected from the daily life of teachers and students. That's where the break comes. As a scientist, you are engaged in your profession. You're not having a ministry of science that tells you what to do and what to think. If you are a medical doctor, you're not looking to the Department of Health to tell you, what to think and what to do. You are building that science, and you work with your colleagues, and you actually learn from and with your mistakes because you share them. You publish the results of your work, and you'll be criticized by your profession, and that will help you improve your practice. In education, if you're criticized, you will defend and redouble your defense in what you had. I think that is the kind of culture that is so different. Yes, there is a lot of research. There is a lot of resources, but I don't think it has the connection with the people who implement it in the practice. Now, we have in education, we have divorced learning from assessment. That's the other part of it. We teach students, and then somebody else walks into your school and tests them, but the two are disconnected. We have divorced research and learning science. Now, we have, disconnected the people who are running our education systems from the ideas that are being generated in ivory towers of universities. And that's where the problem comes from. It's not the absence of research, it's that we do not have an ecosystem that, advances. And in part, it's again, we have this idea, we can train teachers. We send them to 4 years to university, we're going to tell them all the tips and tricks, and then, we let them on their own in the classroom. Rather than saying, we are actually expecting that school becomes a place where everybody learns. Students learn, teachers learn, the system learns from its own, failures and successes. That's, I think, the culture that you'll need to see long-term sustained success now. And actually, I'm not talking theory here. If you look to the most rapidly improving education systems, look to Singapore or China in Asia, look to Finland or Estonia in Northern Europe. That's what you see there. You have basically an army of people in the education systems who become the innovators. No? Innovation in Silicon Valley didn't happen because there was someone at the top of the system who told people what to do. Innovation became because there was an enabling environment and really, really good information flows. And I think, that's what you see in the world's most advanced education systems.
So I'd like to test out an idea on you. We've been speculating that there's one course that is taught in virtually every college around the world, which is economics. Econ 101 is introductory to economics, and that's taught in virtually every college. And if you take the information in Econ 101 and you hand it off to a movie producer, the movie producer would look at that information through a different lens, and he would say, oh, well, we can dramatize this, we can make it much more interesting, we can compress down the amount of time it takes to convey that information, and they would produce something that I would think would be rather interesting. Now, if you take that same information, you hand it off to a game developer, that game developer would look at it through an entirely different lens, and he would say, oh, I think we can gamify this, and we can make it much more fun and much more palatable to a younger generation. And again, we can compress down the time it takes to convey this information. And the same would go with if you handed it off to somebody in the virtual worlds, because the virtual world people think differently than everybody else. So, so if you held a competition for Econ 101 every year, and you handed out a couple $1 million prize each year for the biggest innovation in Econ 101, and you did that for 10 years in a row, my thinking is that after the 10th year, it would be so staggeringly different, we can't even imagine what that would look like from today's perspective. And that ends up being a process to getting to an unknown outcome. I just wanted to get your feedback on using something like that to push the envelope of education.
Absolutely. And I think you can actually do that without your 2 million prize money. What rewards people generally is the intellectual kind of reward that comes from, generating new ideas. And what you suggest is actually existing in some education systems. If you go to Shanghai in China, for example, there is a digital platform where teachers share their lesson plans, their projects, their ideas, and it's all crowdsourced and it's all crowd curated. So the more other teachers like your economics course and, improve it and criticize it and develop it further, the more you rise in recognition in the system. And at the end of the school year, your school principal will not just ask you, how well did you teach your own students in economics, but what contribution did you make to the education systems? How are you regarded by your colleagues in the field? And it is that intellectual kind of recognition that drives people. I think it's not the money. I think in education, we often use financial incentives in a very simplistic way. We try to make education financially attractive, but not intellectually attractive. That's really, I think, where you need to work on. But I think the idea that you frame is exactly the right approach. Make the people who deliver education the designer of their practice. They get that feedback. They understand what students learn and how they don't learn, and they can actually refine their processes. So absolutely, I think that is the future of learning. And it exists in some education and some school systems today.
I don't think we should discount the role that financial incentives can play, though. So one of the best English teachers in Korea is this guy that makes like YouTube videos, and he makes courses you can take at home, and he works 60 hours a week and makes about $1 million a year. And I submit that $1 million a year for a work week like that is a pretty strong incentive to get the lesson plans right.
Yeah, it can work. But again, I've studied that actually over many years. So how do you get, for example, your brightest teachers into difficult schools? Because that's where they can make so much of a difference. People have tried that with money, and you have to pay huge salary differentials to motivate a great teacher to teach in a really rough and tough school. That's not very easy. If you approach it the other way around, you create an environment where you basically say, you take on these really difficult schools, and you'll be in a career elevator. You're going to get the best, colleagues and principals to help you. We are going to look after your family. We are going to support you. Suddenly, you create an environment where people actually feel this is the most privileged place to work on. Once again, if you are a surgeon, you don't want to operate an appendix every day. You want to do the most difficult, the toughest, the most demanding operations. Why? Not because you get better paid, but because that is, your ethos, your kind of idea of the profession, the recognition is coming from. And I think we need to create more of that in education. We talked about innovation. We are not very good in recognizing the innovators. Actually, we often penalize people for being innovative. I'm not saying this. I'm not making this up. When we surveyed American teachers, 75% of American teachers said to us, if I'm more innovative in my teaching, I'm rather going to be penalized than rewarded or recognized for this. And I think that is the culture that really, drives out what you are just suggesting, right. That you actually, try and test new ideas and refine them in the light of real experience. So, money can help you with this. But again, I think money is not sufficient to get people to change their habits.
So let's get a little into your research. So your book, World Class, How to Build a 21st Century School System, looks at decades worth of, or it summarizes rather, decades worth of research in which you've done studies and surveys, and you've looked in a great deal of depth at different school systems. So why don't you just take us through what that research process has been like and what the main takeaways are? Like where are the most innovative school systems in the world? How do they distinguish themselves from other approaches?
Yeah, first of all, the time scale, it is really necessary. If you improve early childhood education today, it's going to take 20 years until you can see that impact. So I had to really look at this over very long periods of time to really study, which education systems had really durable, sustainable, positive long-term outcomes. I started with a very disparate set of countries, and what the hardest part was actually to break through, the kind of cultural barriers that we often make up, to find the shared ideas where people use different language. And the longer, I worked on this, the more I found that actually what drives educational success is remarkably similar across countries and cultures. It comes down to a few things. Sometimes, some are hard to sort of crystallize, the value that a society places on education. Japanese parents are going to invest their last effort, their last resources in the education of their children, which is, the future of the country. In our Western societies, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption.
Right.
So that's, the price society places on the future, the kind of choices it makes between the present and the future. The second part is the really deep belief that everybody can succeed, that every student can learn. What we do in the Western world often is we make it far too easy for young people who are not learning in our way of teaching them. Rather than thinking, I have to change my approach to teaching, rather than leveling down the horizon, I need to level up my approaches to teaching. Again, that's the hallmark of high-performing education systems. What struck me most, why I cared about Finland in this report, was not their high overall performance on international rankings, but the fact that they had only 5% of the performance variation lying between schools. Now, the closest school was always the best school, and that really was amazing to me. How do they make success systemic throughout the system? And it's because of that. Now, this belief everybody can succeed, we got to look at the conditions that actually make everybody successful. The third area, in very different means, but always the same concept, is how do you align resources with needs? Now, how do you attract the most talented teacher to the most challenging classroom? United States is a case in point. You spend more money on education than virtually every, industrialized education system. But, the money often doesn't arrive where it's most needed. First of all, half of your resources never make it into the classroom. So they end up somewhere, on the way. And the half that ends up in the classroom usually ends up in, children where you do not make that much of a difference. If you come from a wealthy background, you'll have many open avenues to success. You'll always be successful, even if you don't do so well in school. If you come from a really disadvantaged backgrounds, your teacher, your school is the only card you can play. So actually aligning resources with needs is what you can see. You look at Britain, the pupil premium, basically giving schools money for actually addressing particularly difficult students. The Chinese approach to align career paths with challenges. You want to advance in your career, the only way is to actually get on with a kind of tougher situation. So I think this alignment of resources with needs, the investments in teachers, in a way, the way in which do we, build a kind of industrial system where teachers are just, exchangeable widgets on an assembly line, just supposed to do what they have been told, or do we invest in a high quality profession? And you have to make choices. If you want a smaller class, you pay a very high price for that in terms of, having less money there for paying teachers well and for giving them, better working conditions. And again, I think once you study this, you'll find that actually it is not rocket science. That is for me was a big revelation. That's really why I wrote this book, really to show is we are not talking at an insoluble problem. We're talking about something that is actually doable and has been done quite successfully. You can see countries, a country like Vietnam, even in our international comparisons, I didn't have on my radar screen until, 6-7 years ago. And suddenly, they turn out as one of the world's, most rapidly improving education systems because they follow, the same kind of principles.
So to me, it seems like it is a really huge problem. Maybe I'm just looking at it from the perspective of an American, but what are the steps that we take to begin to cut this Gordian knot? I mean, on the one hand, we need to attract, more talented people. We need to remunerate them somehow, not necessarily with actual dollars, but with intellectual satisfaction. We need to encourage innovation, but there's really a lot of gridlock in the American system. I mean, between the teachers' unions and public policy and just 100 years of doing things a certain way. I have no idea how you would even begin to address that problem. So I'm sure you do. What's the best way to move forward?
Well, I think one very important first step is, and that was tried, a few years ago, the Common Core, to get a shared understanding of what education should be about. If you do not have a shared notion of what really good education looks like, it's going to take you a long time, or you will never get there. And I actually was very impressed by that effort in the United States, where people, work together to think through that question. And I think a curriculum, a kind of good instructional system, is a starting point for a good education system. You cannot get a good teacher if you cannot define what a good teacher is, really. And I think that's not a difficult thing to do. Actually, many countries have been able to build agreement, even in complex situations. My country, Germany, is also, very complex in governance, has states like the United States. Decisions are made in all sorts of levels. But they got their act together based on poor PISA results to actually change that. And I think that's a very important starting point, to have that conversation of what is it that we expect from education. And once you have that, a lot of other things fall in place. The second part is, we've seen a trend towards commodifying education. Students became consumers, and teachers are considered service providers, and parents, clients. And that has certain advantages, but it also has the big disadvantage that nobody feels responsible. Everybody does their little part. I think, we need to, again, create more of that, this is a whole of society project. And once you actually get parents better information into their hands, some things are simple. If parents get a kind of WhatsApp message or a Facebook message every, day from what their children are doing in school, actually they start to relate very differently to what their children do. And our research has shown, where parents simply ask the question, how was school? That's not about, spending 3 hours of homework with your child. That's simply showing your child what you do is important to me. That had a better impact on, learning outcomes than parental income. So again, it's not rocket science. It's simply, getting people to think about problems together. And I think you can change those kinds of support structures. The last thing which I would touch is the things that you spend most of the energy on in the United States, is the structures of the system. For me, they are the consequence, not the cause of the problem. The kind of all the accountability system, this is all about managing mistrust. That's sort of what the outgrowths, the kind of bureaucracy, the kind of complicated wage agreements. I think once you have a system with greater ownership, those things become a lot less relevant. You cited the unions, and I agree with you. They are a big headache in many education systems. But often, you could say that education systems get kind of the union that they deserve. In a sense, that if you have a very industrial work organization, you're going to get a union that fights on industrial issues, because that's how they can, define their identity. If you have a professional work organization in education, your union is going to change. I give you one example of this, which I followed very early in my career. In Sweden, they introduced individualized pay in the early 90s. And that, of course, was a kind of red flag for the unions. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. But they introduced it. And actually, 3-4 years later, suddenly teachers understood, hey, the system is actually working well for me. I go to a tougher school, I get a better salary. I teach a subject that is really, more in demand, I'll get a better salary. And once the teachers had changed their mind, the unions changed their mind. Suddenly they saw, actually, it's working for us. So I think, if you change your system, you'll change the dynamic between government and unions. And that's, I think, the better way than to fight that battle and never win it.
Well, what if we just expanded the scope of private schools? And I don't just mean schools that accept tuition for their students, but I mean schools that depart radically from the existing way of doing things. And one thing I'm not really clear on is a tension in several of the comments you've made. And so you've said that you want to increase and encourage innovation, but that also it's very important for everyone to kind of agree on what constitutes a good teacher and a good education. And I'm not really sure how to square those two things, because it seems like if we all agree that education is X, but I'm an innovative teacher and I see that that's missing something important and I depart from that, that would be encouraging innovation, but also going against the need to have a set standard way of measuring these things and approaching that problem. So I'm not sure how those two things interact.
Well, in the United States, you do that so well in the field of science and research. You have an agreed, set of, knowledge in the field of science, but you as a researchers are encouraged, incentivized to challenge this, to add to this, to put it into question. And once you succeed, you're actually rewarded by your community for that. And then you contribute it, and then your knowledge will become part of the system, and that's what you're recognized for. That's really what I'm talking about. And private schools can be a big part of that solution. In fact, there are entire systems built around it. If you go to the Netherlands, if you go to Hong Kong, every school is a private school. It's run by, some private entity, has its own philosophy, its own. But, and this is the important point, they're all connected within a public education system. So they're not, little silos standing everywhere, but, they share their knowledge. They compete for students. The teachers move across the system because they have, shared kind of standards, so that if you as a teacher want to work in a different school, it's actually very easy. You can take your retirement fund and all of this with you. So you can see actually the private initiative is there, but at the same time, they create a system around it. The more private initiative you have in the system, the stronger your regulatory environment needs to be. And I think one of the issues I have seen in the United States is that actually, privatization in education has seen as being as we also need to get rid of regulation. So we just, let 1,000 flowers bloom without building a system for knowledge mobilization and sharing. And I think you can look how, the voucher schools or the, charter schools in Hong Kong, Netherlands, Belgium, produce amazing results. As a parent, you can choose, I use this kind of philosophy. I go to Montessori school, I go to Waldorf school. And then at the end of the day, there is again a shared exam. So you can actually see what results you're getting for what approach. I think that's a system that offers a lot of flexibility. But what is so interesting, when you survey schools, they belong to, private entities, when you survey them, they still consider themselves as part of the public school system. That's their philosophy. We are part of a school system, but we are different from anybody else, and we compete on our own ideas.
So I was recently, a few months back, I was asked by a group in Korea to create a video series on the future of education, and I decided to approach this with the overall theme of understanding the world they will inherit. And so by thinking about what the world's going to be like 20, 30, 40 years in the future, then we can kind of understand what the young people today, these young people are going to be our future leaders, they're going to be our future politicians, our doctors, our lawyers, our teachers, and and they're the ones that are going to need to learn all these new skills to work in that world. And so we've been looking at this from a number of different vantage points, and I was wanting to, if you could comment on the changing nature of skills moving into the future, because a lot of the skills that we had in the past are far less relevant than they'll be 20 years from now.
I like your approach. I really think if we start to imagine the future, or even multiple futures, the drivers of those futures, I think we will get a much better understanding of what we need to learn today to be ready for that future and not our past. And I think, we can anticipate how certain types of skills become less relevant. That's what we are seeing. Routine cognitive skills are losing very rapidly in value. We are seeing a rise in, creative skills, the capacity to imagine, your capacity to manage and resolve tensions and dilemmas, your capacity to mobilize cognitive, social, emotional resources. I think those are rising in importance, and we can track that. And but I also think that's sets the direction. What you also, I think, need to build is great resilience among learners tomorrow. Basically, they need to anticipate that it's not just about learning, but it's also about your willingness and capacity to unlearn and to relearn when the context changes. Now, I think that's something to be ready for the unpredictable. And we do often the opposite in education. We make people believe in our own ideas, or we teach them, the established wisdom of our times. We don't teach them to question the wisdom of our times and to build that mindset that we constantly need to be willing to put into question what we have learned and be ready for new paradigms of thinking and walking. And I think if you have both, you have a sort of imagination of the future and a kind of direction of travel, and then you build that kind of cognitive, social, and emotional resilience, I think you'll set a very, very good foundation for people's success now.
What would a curriculum that focuses on that look like? Because it wouldn't be hard to just ask a couple of questions and get some essays and grade them and call it a day. But if you really want to build soft skills like that, creativity or the ability to resolve tensions, that's a much bigger lift. And there's all these issues around evaluating whether or not you've done a good job, because it's often kind of nebulous. Like, what does it mean to effectively do this? I mean, sometimes it's not possible to resolve the tensions. So how do you build those skills, assess them over time, and track students through the curriculum and verify that you're accomplishing the goal you've set for yourself?
Especially skills like resilience and resourcefulness and flexibility and things like that.
Yeah, it's hard to define. It's hard to track.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think it's if you put yourself into the space of a traditional school where students sit behind individual desks and do individual work, then it becomes an uphill struggle. But if you sort of are more open to the learning environments you're willing to consider, I think it's not impossible. In my country, in Germany or Switzerland, vocational education is actually often the most popular route for young people. Despite the fact, we pay people to go to university. There's no fee, and to get even a grant from the government to go there. And still, the majority of young people choose to learn with real people on a real workplace because of this. They like this authentic environment, and it gives you a great career. So I think, you just have to be imaginative about learning environments, giving people more opportunities to learn with real people in collaborative work environments. You need to give people, if you want people to be creative, you need to give them more opportunities to take risks, to make mistakes, to learn from and with mistakes. Of course, it's harder to design learning environments for this, but I don't think it's impossible. Actually, I think there are many teachers doing a very good job for this. So I think the learning part is actually easier. The assessment part, as you say, it is the hard part. I think what often happens is that we define the gateways so narrow that many of the things we're talking about get lost at that point of assessment. But think a few years ahead, looking at technology. I think, are we going to see traditional school tests with bubble sheets in 5 years? I don't think so. I think we will have technology that will actually track in real time, how you learn, where you learn, when you learn, what you learn, and actually give you real-time feedback. I think, this idea that you need to define a kind of narrow goalpost and see whether everybody gets there, I don't think that's going to be so much longer relevant. I think actually probably this is an area where technology can really give us entirely new, because it's important. If we get the assessment part wrong, we will not incentivize the kind of learning and teaching. And I also think, a more authentic learning environment deals with this huge issue of motivation. If you give young people a really challenging problem and you give them the resources and the support to actually address this, they'll spend, hours and hours, well beyond school hours, to solve that thing with huge enthusiasm and everything. So I think actually, motivation is often a reflection of the learning environment, and I think we can, and particularly for disadvantaged students. If you come from a wealthy background, again, your parents will have successfully told you, well, you have to listen to all of this nonsense, you have to do your test well, then you have a great life. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you don't see that, and therefore you give up much, much more easily. But by creating a different set of learning environments, I think you can frame that very differently. And I think there are many very good examples today where that is happening. But on the assessment side, I agree with you. That is the harder part of the problem, and I think one where the current, frameworks are not helping us. They hinder us. I think we need to look more to technology-based assessment systems that integrate learning and assessment.
So you and I met on a Doing Good, Doing Well panel that was focused on the future of education in the post-COVID world. But I was struck by how often your answers engaged with this question about technology. So how do you feel about the possibility of remote learning, platforms like Khan Academy or Coursera, Udacity, and especially advancing them so that they can handle more of these creative questions and creative assessments?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's unfortunate if we associate digital learning with remote learning, because I do believe that learning is not a transactional phenomenon, but a social and a relational phenomenon. I think that's very, very important. If you do not, and I think that is where the strength of technology lies. Now, otherwise, you just need television. So I really think we should not, say digital learning is about remote learning. I would also say, Khan Academy, it's for me, technology conserving traditional teaching, not technology transforming the way of learning. So I really think that's where I see the future. I can see, for example, AI-based system understanding, how people learn differently. Why you work on a problem in mathematics, the computer will be able to see, how you learn, where you struggle, where you succeed, where you get bored, where you get really interested, and then adapt learning environments. Because we never learn in linear ways. We always learn with this kind of moment where we understand something. And I think technology supported by teachers can really get you there. Again, we spoke about, the assessment part. Learning analytics will be hugely important. Getting better signals to educators, to students themselves, how different students learn differently, and then engage with that diversity with more differentiated practice. Now, I think, sensors in a classroom, learning analytics, I think will be a huge part of that picture of the future. And the last element is, blockchain technology. The credentialing part is really where many of the problems currently come from. And in a way, all the colleges, you have created such a monopolistic sector that, can decide, what is good and what is not good. And that often, extracts huge monopoly rents from prospective students. Now, I think the future is with very granular kind of ways of credentialing learning throughout our lives. Again, I think this idea that you get a college degree and then are on your own is a thing of the past. The future is really about this kind of more granular recognition of what people can actually do. You put those three things together, and I think we will have a very different culture of learning, a learning which, gives people more ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn, and learning where people distribute learning very differently over their life cycle. Now, not this idea I have to rush through all of this and then get out, rather than saying, well, I will integrate, learning or working, and not learn for the job, but see my job as the opportunity for learning. So I think really there is huge potential. And again, I think the pandemic has done one thing that is really transformational. It has changed the social acceptance of technology in education. Before the pandemic, it was always seen as something that you sprinkle on top, and then, it was more a nuisance. Nobody was really prepared for it. Now, basically, people see, well, learning is not a place. Learning is an activity now.
Yeah, well stated. That's very well stated.
So in the last minutes here, I wanted to speculate a little bit about what the future of this might look like. So this is a futurist podcast, so we have people on to talk about quantum computing or nanotechnology or AI or any of these other things. So we've sort of brushed up against this. How do you think that the emergence of advanced artificial intelligence, the kind of thing that can manage a whole class and rearrange the curriculum on the fly to account for individual lapses in attention or motivation or individual strengths and weaknesses, will transform the classroom?
Well, it will. Actually, I don't think it will actually replace teachers and teaching. I think it will transform teachers and teaching. You as a teacher become much more of a designer of that process. You have to less worry about knowledge transmission. You have less worry about, classroom management. You can focus really your energy to understand, who are my students? Who are they? Who do they want to become? How I can support them in that journey? How I can, use the right technologies to help them on their way. I think, so learning, I think, will remain a social experience. But I can see artificial intelligence, big data, learning analytics, and blockchain together fundamentally transforming that experience. And in different ways. Maybe one day technology will override all our educational institutions. It's quite possible. It's a scenario. We just learn on our own. The devices will be everywhere. There will be not a moment in your life that is not about learning. It could be that technology will reinforce our institutions, that schools will become more a hub of, communities, where actually communities pool their resources to actually, develop the talent they need. It's very hard to predict, but I think it will certainly transform the process of learning and make teaching a much more kind of rewarding profession. And we should not see technology and people at opposing ends of the spectrum. They really, I think, will only make sense together. That's also a lesson from the pandemic. Just remote learning, distance learning has not really done much to, help people. No?
So how would you describe the student experience 20 years from now? Are they still going to go to a school? Are they still going to go to a classroom? Will they have devices they attach to their ear? Will we force them to put holes in their head so we can pour the information in? Can you step us through that?
Well, I'm not, so much engaged in those kinds of, technologies. And probably the answer will be very different for different age groups. I personally believe that there is a role for people coming together for learning, to have a space in your life that is really dedicated to inquiry, to the future. It's not that you just work and learn little chunks and pieces when you need them, but I think there is a reason why people, dedicate time and energy in a space to work together in this kind of social process of learning. But I also think, when it comes to probably we will see the, integration of learning and work much earlier in the lives of people, where you can try out things, make a real difference in something, experiment on your own, and have much greater flexibility. And which, by the way, raises huge challenges for teachers. The more flexibility you'll have in your education systems, the harder it will be for teachers to sort of pull all of this together, for governments to create equitable learning opportunities. I think that's really the big challenge. But I think I can see technology to become the big enabler. The problems that we have today with inequality in education is in part a resource issue, but it's also in part an outgrowth of this very industrial way of working. We teach everybody in the same way in the hope that, they will come out the same way. We do not, students with special needs, they are not getting the attention and the time and the dedication they need simply because there's no one looking how they learn differently. And I think this kind of more personal experience of learning, I think, is where you're going to see the big changes coming from. And I think it's what we have done in school is we had, in the past classes of 50 students, then we reduced them to 40 and 30 and now 20. But we've never changed that mentality that all the students that sit in front of us are the same. I think that is the quantum change that we need to achieve to understand this is an N of one. You need to understand, and then you need to create the learning environments through, technology to recognize how that students learn. And rather than reducing class size, do more about truly personalizing learning experiences.
So would you say you are hopeful for the future of education? And if so, why?
Well, I think you see some education systems that have made enormous strides towards a better future. What makes me hopeful that it's not just a question of resources. If it would all be about money, I would be very pessimistic because money will always be short. But it's not. I actually think it's more about better policy, better practice. It's more about people, and I am hopeful. I think we have seen a lot of positive development. Unfortunately, not in too many places. I think in a way we have become very complacent in our current institutional structure. So, but it can be done. Whether it will be done, it's very hard to predict. No?
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this has been great.